our current government, and indeed many previous governments, came in without a plan and without an idea of what to do.
That's ultimately what government is. It is a big, complex, multi-billion-pound organisation. There's almost no one around in that mix who's worked at any sort of senior level in big businesses that have looked at this.
So I've got a stat here that says 54% of adults feel uncomfortable asking offenders to turn it down. Do we basically just need to go the full generic and harden up and start confronting people when we find stuff annoying and antisocial?
I mean, there is a general problem in Britain at the moment that we have actually quite a lot of criminal laws, but our enforcement is extremely lax.
Hello and welcome to The Capitalist. I'm Joseph Dinnage, the deputy editor of CapX. I'm covering for Mark as he's on holiday, so you'll have to put up with me today. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr Lawrence Newport, who is the co-founder of the Looking for Growth and Crush Crime campaigns, but most importantly, most impressively, is a fortnightly columnist for CapX. You all must read it, it's very good. And I'm also joined by political strategist John Oxley, who also writes the Joxley Writes Substack. So, August's lull tends to be when Treasury officials test drive ideas for the autumn budget, and this year is no exception. And among the proposals floated last week, we found out that replacing stamp duty with a new property sales tax was one of them. But with Britain's tax system being as labyrinthine, complex and unfair as it is this just tinkering when what our economy needs is radical surgery? John, I was wondering what you think of that. Is this just tinkering? Does this go far enough?
I think it is just tinkering. I think everyone knows, and a lot of people like me who find this stuff quite interesting have lots of conversations that are boring to everyone else. But Britain has an incredibly complicated tax system. We've spent years and years bolting on new bits, new exceptions to try and tinker around the edges. You know, a classic one is putting that on and off various different products. And we have a system that is very difficult to understand, which creates a whole lot of secondary costs for business and individuals trying to get it right. It distorts lots of bits of different markets. And ideally, you would tear a lot of it away and start with a blank piece of paper. But that's very hard for governments to do. It is repairing the aeroplane whilst it's flying. And so what we have is more conversations like this, where we look at a tax like stamp duty that almost everyone knows is bad and think, how can we adjust this slightly? And we've seen the ceilings change. We've seen the bands change. We're now looking at switching it into a property sales tax. But does that really go far enough? Probably not. And the big problem is we're not saying, really, okay, we're going to change this tax. How does that knock onto all the other taxes that people are paying? And does it result in the best for the economy, the best for fairness, and the best for delivering for public services?
Lawrence, is John right? But I mean, to give the economy the supply side shock that we know it needs and to reform the tax system in such a way that would actually make people's lives better and more affordable, do politicians just need to be a bit more courageous?
I think that's entirely true. I would say that it's certainly a welcome change. Stamp duty is really not great at all. And I think picking up on what John was saying, this is a positive change, but it is of course nowhere near enough. And actually, as I've written a few times, in the column as well, if I can plug that again, it is indeed the fact that our politicians are really, one, not brave enough to step out of the kind of Westminster bubble that they're in, and they are not looking the problems directly in the eye and just unfortunately coming out with the leadership necessary to steer the ship of state in the state that it is currently in. But it is also downstream of the fact that our current government, and indeed many previous governments, came in without a plan and without an idea of what to do. So John is correct that they are actually trying to to not have too many metaphors here, but yes, keep the plane in the air at the same time as repairing it. But this is something that they could have planned before they were in charge, before they had the controls, and they did not do that planning. And as a result, we are in this continued situation. And that has to be a lesson for any following government, or indeed for the current stock of politicians. They need to take stock and actually produce ideas before, for the current government, it's too late, and for ourselves, before the British public suffers yet more turbulence.
And Lawrence, I thought you might like this idea. So in Australia, the government has convened an economic roundtable of business leaders and experts to map out deeper reforms to Australia's economy. I know that you are a fan of those whom Dominic Cummings affectionately refers to as weirdos and misfits. Is what we need really to get rid of a load of Treasury orthodoxy mandarins and instead have our own kind of external council of misfits who can think creatively and unconventionally about policy solutions?
I think some creative thinking here is extremely necessary. And certainly at LFG, looking for growth events, people that come along are from outside of politics, often have started their own businesses or are interested in doing so, and they have fresh ideas, and actually find a lot of the time it quite mystifying why government is so limited in the way they think about things, and why systems have been in place for decades and decades, despite the huge technological changes that we've seen over the past multiple decades. And yet our systems are stubbornly stuck in a dated and now completely broken way of working.
And John, do you get the impression that Labour have or feel any imperative to unclog these broken systems of government that often stifle attempts to get real reform over the line?
Don't think there's any sense of that at all. I think Keir Starmer is someone who has a background in he ran the DPP very well, but he ran it maintaining an institution. He wasn't radical in his changes. I think a lot of the people around him, whether that's advisors or whether that's people in cabinet, just don't have that mindset and that look of how you get big organizations, because that's ultimately what government is. It is a big, complex, multi-billion-pound organization, and how you get things changed in those organizations. There's very few people who have, there's very few organizations that exist on the scale of government, but even on a departmental level, there's almost no one around in that mix who's worked at any sort of senior level in big businesses that have looked at this for themselves, or even value that sense of expertise and decision making. And really, much like the last government, they get sucked into reactive day-to-day decision making and management, rather than thinking, actually, how do we pull this apart and build something bigger, build something new and more effective to deliver what we're trying to achieve.
And of course, our labyrinthine and complex tax system is not the only one of our woes. There's also a sort of social stagnation that people feel as though the government is not taking appropriate action against. And it was interesting to hear, to move on a bit, that the Tories have proposed fines for those passengers on public transport who play loud music from their phones. The Shadow Transport Secretary, Richard Holden, has robustly insisted that commuters shouldn't be forced to endure somebody else's crap taste in music. Very punchy indeed. But with fare evasion vandalism rife across the public transport network, is a lack of rules really the problem, or is it a question of enforcement? Lawrence?
There is a general problem in Britain at the moment that we have actually quite a lot of criminal laws, but our enforcement is extremely lax. I believe on the railways in particular, there are a lot of very wide-ranging and wide-reaching powers for transport police. How much and how widely they're used, I'm not sure. Certainly, it is extremely annoying that there are vast numbers of people, well, not vast, but certainly a high enough percentage of people in the country who are very happy to play things at extreme volume on public transport, ruining kind of everyone else's commute or travel around them. Would make exceptions maybe for screaming toddlers that need to be placated.
Very soft.
Yes, sometimes necessary. But I think there's something here about, yes, enforcement is something which we lack in general, and in fact, I think we should look much more into that before adding more laws to the books.
And John, would you would you back the Tories' proposal for a fine for those playing this stuff from their phones?
I think I'm going to come across as very wet here. I just think it's the sort of thing that shouldn't be being policed by government and the police. I think this is much more of it is a great example of how we've fallen into this trap of thinking there is a big problem, or not even a big problem. There is a thing that annoys me here. It's time for the government to do something about it. And I think actually what we need on this is just a bit more focus on, if someone's playing loud music, most of the time they're not that scary. You can just tell them to stop it. Sometimes they are, and that's the sort of thing the police should be worried about. But I think you're just in danger of outsourcing everything that's an issue with society and respect and how we treat each other to a police force that is always going to be overstretched, train officials that are always going to be overstretched. And I'd rather my train officials are, helping people with disabilities that can't get around the stations properly, which is another issue we have, or our police are, going out and tackling organised crime gangs rather than patrolling up and down, handing out fines, when 99% of the time, if you said to someone, "I'm sorry, could you turn that off, please?" in a very British way, they're probably going to do it. And so I just think it's that sort of thinking that just leads to more and more laws that already do the same thing, or we should just not be getting the state involved for, and actually we should all be taking a bit more responsibility for what our civic life is like.
So I've got a question for both of you. So if we've established that this is massively annoying and we don't like to hear other people's stuff playing out loud on trains, and we've also feel that it really shouldn't be up to the cops to deal with this. Let's not introduce another kind of unnecessary law that invariably won't be properly enforced. So I've got a stat here that says 54% of adults feel uncomfortable asking offenders to turn it down. Do we basically just need to go the full generic and harden up and start confronting people when we find stuff annoying and antisocial?
My co-founder, one of my co-founders at LFG, has done this a few times, and in fact tweeted about it. In fact, did it when we went to our LFG Manchester show on the train there. Joe, my co-founder, got up and told someone to stop playing music. They were not very happy about it. I should say they didn't just turn it off. They did get a bit aggressive, not physical, and they calmed down within a couple of minutes or so. But I can understand why people find it very awkward and very difficult. And people do sometimes get, when they're embarrassed, when they've been called out like this, they can get very defensive. And very, very, very rarely is that ever physical, but it can certainly be unpleasantly, aggressive in their language and so forth, which also people don't really want to deal with just traveling somewhere. They just want to be able to travel, focus on themselves and their family, and not have to confront people in this way. But if they did that more, if that happened more frequently, or if train guards did that more frequently, which is why maybe a fine wouldn't have to involve police. It could just involve the train guard, who could just offer an on-the-spot fine, like they do for tickets. That might be something that would discourage this behaviour and mean that people wouldn't have to do that themselves.
And John, is this what we as Britons need, a healthier spirit of public confrontation?
I think so. I mean, again, you always have to judge the situation and who you're dealing with. But, I think historically there was always a sense, sort of growing up, that if you were messing about too much in public, someone would come and have a word with you. And that was quite a useful corrective before it, that simply the fear of it happening was a useful corrective. And, I think we do need to bring a bit of that back and, sort of stand up for society you want to see.
Confronting people who feel emboldened in such a way that they feel as though they can be this obnoxious on public transport can be quite dangerous. So over the weekend we had Notting Hill Carnival, And police faced violence at last year's event with 349 arrests and reports of officers being kicked, punched, pushed, spat at, headbutted and pelted with bottles. Terrible stuff. And this year, 140 arrests were made on the first day alone. Is it time to, given sort of the low trust nature of London, as many of us experience it, is it time to have a rethink of these sorts of events, safety and security?
I think there is, in general, unfortunately, in this country, a whole series of events all around us which are constantly either blocked from happening at all because of planning, or actually now there are extreme amounts of security required for even some quite mundane events. It's really surprising to me that Notting Hill Carnival has the level of violence it actually does when you consider, for instance, rules on anti-terrorism and otherwise. I think it's just this year or just last year, a flower show that's run for about 140 years is no longer able to operate because they have thousands of guests. And because of new anti-terrorism laws, it is so expensive to run the event because they need so many checks and CCTV and otherwise and so forth, that the regulations now prevent them from being able to run this. I think when we get to a point where it is difficult to run events full stop in this country and people are getting more and more miserable because of it, we do actually need to look at, are our laws, one, optimal for this, or are we stopping a bunch of events we want to take place? And two, how is it that events that should fall under this are still ending up with extreme amounts of arrests and some quite disturbing violence?
John, should we accept this kind of thing? Should we really be tolerating events that basically carry a guarantee of very serious violence, like Notting Hill Carnival?
I think, again, I'm going to be a bit wet and liberal here, but I think when you look at something like the Carnival and the numbers of people that attend, I think that they estimate about 1 million a day. Is it that different from an ordinary Friday and Saturday night across our major cities? Probably not that different. It's just concentrated rather than spread out. And a lot of police resources go in. A lot of these arrests, we don't know exactly what they were for. One of the things that we do sort of hear is it's partly the police go out because they know people they want are going to turn up to the Notting Hill Carnival. So it's not necessarily even something they've done on that day. And they were employing things like face recognition to keep, to monitor crowds and particularly look for known troublemakers. I think, everything that we have in life and is enjoyable, as Lawrence says, comes with risks. And I think we have to look at absolutely how we best manage these risks, but in a way that is proportionate for the people involved. And I think, I would add, I can't think of a worse way personally to spend the bank holiday weekend than being at the Notting Hill Carnival. There is nothing about it that appeals to me. But for a huge chunk of London, it is a massive thing that forms a huge part of their year. You see people going in great spirits, traveling around on the tube as you try to avoid it. And, ultimately, I'd rather those things go on than not. Absolutely, we have to look at how to manage them. But, they come with risk. And, the optimum number of bad things happening is not zero. So we just have to manage that appropriately.
I do want to pick up on that it is extremely important that people are able to, we events have risks to them. Obviously, there is balance to be had. I don't know the specifics around exactly with the Notting Hill Carnival what the risk reward ratio is, but certainly events across the country right now are being cancelled, blocked, no longer happening. And this is genuinely making people more miserable. This is something where the country itself is in economic decline and we are making it worse and worse for people every single day. The cost of living is going up and they've got less things to do. This is something where we've got a bunch of regulation that's being piled on, and events that run at very, very close to the margin, often charitable, often don't raise a profit year on year, find themselves just having to shut down things that have gone on for centuries. This is really, really quite depressing and something the government needs to look at immediately. Otherwise, people's lives are just going to continue to get worse.
Yeah, and Lawrence, I think you're right in that the economy's in a terrible shape. young people are seemingly more miserable than ever, and events like Notting Hill Carnival bring a lot of people a lot of joy, and I'm pretty convinced that the majority of people who go there are going there in good faith to basically just have a good time and get a bit drunk. And is there not a danger by banning these kind of things? We essentially genuflect to the troublemakers. We accept that laws can't be enforced, and if anything, just kind of embed the sort of feeling of low trust that pervades our city.
I think it's true that like a lot of this is based on logic. I mean, and as I say, I don't know the exact risk reward for this, but I certainly think as a general rule, the pattern in our country and by our government has been to make things steadily more difficult, and the perhaps unintended consequences of that are very wholesome events that can now no longer happen because the regulatory burden is so high and so expensive that they just simply no longer take place. That is not a good place to be. That is not what we, or anyone really, I'm sure, intended, but it's certainly the reality. And that just adds on top of all the fact of all the pubs we're seeing close. In general, we are seeing here a collapse in people being able to enjoy themselves. And that is something deeply concerning.
Right. Both, with remarkable speed, I think we've come to the end of the show. Thank you both so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to talk to both of you. And thank you to all of you for watching. Make sure you're subscribed to our email briefings at capex.co. I'm Joseph. Thank you and goodbye.